The night before my son's wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a sealed envelope in front of me and 32 years of silence behind me. I wasn't crying. I was past that. 2 weeks earlier, Owen had sat in that same chair, the one where I used to help him with homework after double shifts, and told me, carefully and politely, that it would be better if I didn't come to his wedding. Not because of anything I had done, but because of what I represented, where we came from, what I reminded people of. 32 years of raising him alone. Every overtime shift, every skipped meal, every dream I quietly folded up and put away so his life could be bigger than mine. And somewhere between that struggling single mother and this moment, I had become something he wanted kept out of the frame. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The polite ones never do. What Owen didn't know that night was that I had already made a decision. Not out of anger. Anger burns out of something quieter and much more permanent. The envelope on my table wasn't a threat. It wasn't revenge. It was the moment I finally stopped arranging my life around someone who had stopped seeing me in it. My name is Nora Caldwell, and this is the story of what happens when a mother decides that her worth was never his to assign. 2 weeks before my son's wedding, he sat across from me at my own kitchen table and asked me not to come. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because there was any real conflict between us, simply because he was worried about what certain people might think if they knew where he came from. I want you to understand something before I continue. That kitchen table was the same one where I helped him with homework after 12-hour shifts, the same one where I told him everything would be okay on the nights he cried because his father never called, the same table that held every hard conversation, every quiet meal, every ordinary moment that somehow added up to a life built entirely around making sure his was better than mine. And he sat at that table and asked me to stay home. My name is Nora Caldwell. I raised Owen alone from the time he was 6 years old, the year his father decided that fatherhood was optional. There were years I worked 2 jobs, years when I skipped meals without ever mentioning it, years when every decision I made was filtered through one question: will this help Owen? I never thought of myself as remarkable. I was just a mother doing what needed to be done. What I didn't understand then was that sacrifice, when it goes unacknowledged long enough, eventually becomes invisible. The person who received it stops seeing it as something given and starts seeing it as simply the way things were. Owen became successful, ambitious, polished in ways I never was. I was proud of every bit of it. The problem wasn't his success. The problem was what success quietly did to the way he saw people, including me. When he was 12, he asked me not to pick him up from school in my old sedan because his friends made jokes about it. At 16, he stopped inviting anyone to our house. Too small, he always said. The neighborhood wasn't the right kind. I told myself it was just a teenager wanting to fit in. I told myself that for years. The afternoon he came to ask me about the wedding, I thought he was stopping by to share some last-minute excitement. Instead, he sat down, avoided my eyes, and said, "Mom, I need to ask you something difficult." I remember the room feeling colder. He talked about Lauren's family, about professional connections who would be attending, about expectations and impressions, and how certain things might look. He was careful with every word, polite, almost gentle, and then he said it. Maybe it would be easier if you didn't attend the ceremony. I sat very still. You don't want me at your wedding? It's not like that, he said, but it was exactly like that. He wasn't worried about me causing a scene. He wasn't worried about conflict. He was worried about people knowing where he came from and realizing that where he came from looked like me. I drove home that evening without turning on the radio. There are silences too heavy for noise. What I didn't tell him that afternoon, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that 3 days earlier, I had opened a locked drawer in my desk and pulled out documents I hadn't looked at in years, and I had begun asking myself a question I should have asked much sooner. Was I still planning my future around someone who no longer saw me as part of his? I didn't have the answer yet, but I was finally willing to look for it. If someone in your life has ever made you feel like your presence was something to be managed rather than valued, you already know what that drive home felt like. You don't have to explain it. Some things are understood without words. Drop one word in the comments that describes how you would have felt sitting in that car. Just one word. I want to see what this story is bringing up for people. After Owen left that afternoon, I didn't move from the kitchen table for a long time. His coffee cup was still sitting across from mine, barely touched. I stared at it like it might explain something. It didn't. The house felt different after that. Not empty exactly. I had lived alone for years and made peace with that. It felt more like something had been confirmed, a suspicion I had been quietly carrying for longer than I wanted to admit. I got up eventually, went to the refrigerator for water, and stood there looking at the photos held up by magnets I'd collected over the years. Owen at 7, missing his front teeth, holding a cardboard trophy from a school field day. Owen at 10, asleep on the couch after swearing he would stay up until midnight on New Year's Eve. Owen at 17, in a second-hand suit I had altered myself because we couldn't afford a tailor, standing straight and proud before his first real job interview. I remembered ironing that suit at 5 in the morning so it would be perfect. He got the job. He never mentioned the suit again. I want to ask you something before I go further. Have you ever reached a point where you stopped chasing someone's approval and finally chose your own peace instead? I read every response, and I think more people understand that moment than would ever say it out loud. The wedding exclusion hurt deeply, but if I am being honest with myself, it wasn't the first time. It was just the first time Owen had said it out loud. There was the sedan when he was 12, the house he stopped bringing friends to at 16, the college graduation dinner where he seated me at the far end of the table away from his professors and their spouses, the promotion celebration 2 years ago where he introduced Lauren's parents by name and introduced me simply as someone from back home. Someone from back home. After 32 years, I had become a geographic reference. I never said anything. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself he was busy, distracted, still growing. Mothers are very skilled at finding reasons to excuse what they should be examining. What I didn't fully understand then was that Owen wasn't cruel. Cruel people know what they're doing and do it anyway. Owen was something harder to name, and in some ways, harder to forgive. He had built an identity entirely around forward momentum, around distance from where he started, and somewhere in that construction, I had become part of the past he was moving away from. Not a person, a reminder. 3 days after he left, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk in the spare room, the one I always kept separate from everyday papers, and I pulled out a folder I had been quietly adding to for almost 2 decades. I sat with it at the kitchen table and went through it slowly. When Owen's father left, I made a decision. I would never again allow my financial security to depend entirely on another person. I started small, an automatic transfers account so small I barely noticed them, then a certificate of deposit. Then, when a small rental property in a modest neighborhood came up at a price I could stretch toward, I bought it. That was 16 years ago. I had added 2 more since then. Nothing impressive by any measure, small properties in working-class areas that I maintained carefully and rented to people who needed reliable housing. I had never touched the retirement accounts I opened in my 30s. I had invested conservatively, without drama, without telling anyone. I was not wealthy in the way people mean when they say that word, but I had done quietly and carefully what most people said couldn't be done on a single income. And sitting there that evening, going through those pages, I realized something that surprised me. I had been planning all of this around a future that included Owen at the center of it all. Every decision, every document, every carefully signed beneficiary form had his name on it, not because the law required it, because I had simply assumed that the person I spent my life building something for would naturally be the person I trusted most with what remained. Assumption is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there in the background of every decision you make until, one day, something forces you to look at it directly. I called my attorney the following morning. Her name was Patricia, and she had handled my documents for almost a decade. She was calm, thorough, and not easily surprised. When I explained what I wanted to discuss, she scheduled me for the following Tuesday without asking unnecessary questions. That appointment changed everything, though not in the way people might expect. It wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no ultimatums rehearsed in advance. I simply walked in and told her that I wanted to revisit every assumption I had made about who deserved to be trusted with what I had built. We spent nearly 2 hours going through documents. Some assets I redirected toward a women's shelter 2 towns over that I had volunteered at briefly years ago, a place that helped mothers starting over with almost nothing, which felt appropriate given where I had started myself. A portion went toward a small scholarship fund at the community college where I had taken night classes in my 30s to qualify for a better position at work. The rest went to causes that had mattered to me quietly for years, organizations that did steady, unglamorous work for people rebuilding their lives after being left behind by someone who should have stayed. Patricia asked once, carefully, whether I was acting out of emotion. I understood why she asked. It was her job to ask. I told her the truth. I said that for the first time in a long while, I was acting from the clearest thinking I had done in years. When I left her office, the late afternoon light was doing something warm and unhurried across the parking lot. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel sad. I felt like someone who had just finished a task that was long overdue. That evening, I wrote a letter. Not long, not dramatic, just honest in the way that things can finally be honest when there is nothing left to protect. I wrote about what I had built and why I had changed its direction. I wrote about what 32 years had looked like from where I was standing, and on the final page, I wrote one line that said everything I needed to say. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a plain white envelope, and sealed it. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then I put it in my purse. The wedding was tomorrow. By tomorrow afternoon, my son would finally understand that respect and inheritance are not the same thing, and that one cannot be substituted for the other. Before I finish this story, I want to ask you something honestly. Do you believe some relationships can truly heal after this kind of hurt? Or do certain actions permanently change what 2 people can be to each other? Tell me what you think below. And if this story reminded you of someone who has been carrying something like this quietly, feel free to pass it along. Sometimes people just need to hear that their feelings make sense. The morning of Owen's wedding, I woke up before my alarm. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house, then got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while the neighborhood slowly came to life. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I was something harder to name. The way a person feels after a long decision has finally been made, and there is nothing left to do but move through the day. I chose a simple blue dress, not to impress anyone, not to make a statement, just because it was the kind of thing I would wear on any day I wanted to feel like myself. I looked in the mirror once, picked up my purse, checked that the envelope was inside, and left. The church was already filling when I arrived. I found a seat near the back without speaking to anyone. Nobody stopped me. Owen had never officially told me I couldn't come. He had simply hoped I would choose to stay away. I hadn't. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that weddings always are when you let yourself see them honestly. Lauren looked radiant, genuinely happy in a way that had nothing performed about it. Owen stood at the altar, straight and confident, the way he had learned to carry himself over years of working very hard to become someone the world would take seriously. I watched him and felt something complicated move through me. Pride and grief and finality all at once, sitting together the way feelings sometimes do when there is no clean separation between them. I thought about the boy who fell asleep on the couch trying to stay up until midnight. I thought about the secondhand suit I altered by hand at 5 in the morning. I thought about every ordinary moment that had quietly added up to the man standing at that altar. He learned his posture somewhere. He learned his determination somewhere. He learned that hard work was worth it because he watched someone do it without complaint for 32 years. He had just stopped remembering where any of it came from. After the ceremony, the guests spilled outside into the warm afternoon. I waited near the edge of the crowd until the photographs were done and the first wave of congratulations had passed. Then I walked over. Lauren saw me first and hugged me with a warmth that told me clearly she had no idea what had happened between Owen and me. She was kind in that instinctive way some people are, without calculation, and it made what Owen had done feel lonelier somehow. Owen looked surprised when he saw me, not angry, surprised, and underneath that, something closer to unease. I didn't give him time to find his footing. I took the envelope from my purse and held it out to him. "This isn't a wedding gift," I said quietly. "Read it when you have a quiet moment." He took it and glanced down at it, distracted already by someone calling his name from across the courtyard. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. I didn't wait for him to find words. I said I hoped the day was everything they had planned, and then I walked to my car and drove home. No scene, no speech, no waiting to see his face change. Some exits are more powerful than any entrance. That evening, I made dinner, watched something forgettable on television, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. My phone stayed quiet until nearly 11. Then it rang. Owen's name on the screen. I looked at it and let it ring. It rang again at 11:47, then twice more before midnight. I lay in the dark and listened to the silence after each call and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not guilt either, just a steadiness that had been missing for a long time. The following morning, Lauren called. Not Owen, Lauren. Her voice was composed but careful, in the way people sound when they are trying to be fair to everyone at once. She said she hadn't known, that Owen had told her I preferred not to attend, that she had accepted that because she had no reason not to. Then she said the thing that I suspected had kept Owen awake all night. She had asked him one question after reading the letter, just one. "Why didn't you simply invite your mother?" She told me he hadn't been able to answer it, not in any way that held together. 2 days later, he came to the house. I heard his car in the driveway and waited at the kitchen table, the way I had learned to wait for things, without rehearsing, without preparing speeches, just present. He looked exhausted when he came in. older than he had looked at the altar 2 days before. He sat down across from me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said he was sorry. Not a qualified sorry. Not the careful, managed apology of someone protecting themselves while appearing to take responsibility. Just sorry. Plainly, with nothing attached to it. I let the words sit between us for a moment before I answered. I told him that I understood more than he might think, that I knew he hadn't set out to become someone who was ashamed of where he came from, that ambition does something to people sometimes, not all at once, not with any single decision, but gradually, quietly, the way a house settles over years until one day a door no longer closes the way it used to. He looked at the table. He said he had spent so long trying to build something that looked a certain way that he had stopped noticing what he was actually doing to the people around him. He said Lauren had made that very clear over the past 2 days. I believed him, but belief is not the same as trust, and trust is not rebuilt in an afternoon at a kitchen table, no matter how honest the conversation is. I told him that. I also told him the one thing I needed him to understand before anything else could move forward between us. I said it quietly, without anger, because it was simply true. I told him I had spent 32 years building his future, that I had done it without keeping score, without expecting repayment, without needing recognition, but that I would not spend whatever time I had left begging for a place in his life. That I was not a chapter from his past to be quietly closed. I was his mother, and that either meant something or it didn't. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in the way of someone who has understood something they cannot ununderstand. He didn't ask about the estate, not once during that entire conversation. I noticed that. It mattered more than he probably realized. We talked for a long time, not because everything was resolved. Nothing was resolved, not really, but because for the first time in longer than I could remember, we were actually speaking honestly to each other without anyone performing anything for anyone else. He left in the early evening. I stood at the door and watched his car disappear down the street, and then went back inside to the kitchen. Same table, same quiet house. But the feeling sitting in the room was different from anything that had been there before. I kept my decision. I didn't change it that day or the weeks after. Some things need more than an honest conversation to earn back. Maybe that changes with time. Maybe it doesn't. That isn't the part of the story I know the ending to yet. What I do know is this. The afternoon I walked out of Patricia's office and sat in my car in the late light, I felt something shift that has not shifted back. Not because I had punished my son, not because I had taken something from him, but because I had finally stopped arranging my own life around whether or not he approved of it. That is not revenge. Revenge keeps you in the same room as the thing that hurt you, just on the opposite side of it. What I felt was different. It was the feeling of a door I had been standing in front of for years, finally walking through. My life had always belonged to me. I had simply forgotten that for a while. I didn't forget it again. Some people will hear this story and ask whether I made the right decision, whether I was too hard, whether a mother should always forgive, always bend, always find a way back regardless of what happened. I understand that question. I asked it myself many times. But here's what I learned. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. I forgave Owen long before he ever came to that kitchen table. I forgave him the moment I drove home from that conversation and sat alone with cold coffee and 32 years of memories. What I could not give back automatically, what had to be earned slowly and honestly, was trust. And that is not hardness. That is just the truth about how respect works between people. It cannot be assumed. It cannot be inherited. It has to be chosen, repeatedly, in small moments and large ones alike. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever made yourself smaller to keep someone comfortable, if you have ever been made to feel like a chapter someone wanted to skip past, I want you to know something. Your history is not something to be managed. The people who built themselves quietly, without applause, without recognition, while everyone else was busy becoming impressive, those people deserve to take up space. You deserve to take up space. My name is Nora Caldwell, and the most important decision I ever made was not the one involving documents or attorneys or white envelopes. It was the quieter decision that came before all of that. The moment I stopped waiting for my son to tell me I was worth something and remembered that I already knew.